Okay, so welcome back everyone for our third class on the Jewish genius of S.Y. Agnon. It's great to have you all with us again. Just a couple quick little notes before we get started here. Firstly, as some of you may be aware, there is a snowstorm, or there was a snowstorm in Yerushalayim and in Israel, which is where Rabbi Sachs is. So he's going to be joining us from home today. There's a possibility that due to the snow, we could lose him. There may be a power outage or something along those lines. So we ask that you just kind of stick with us. We'll do everything we can if that does happen to get him back and proceed with the course. So just stay tuned if we lose him for a minute. Also, I just want to make everybody aware of the next upcoming class, the next upcoming course in these Open University series that we offer. It will be with Michael Duran from the Hudson Institute. He'll be doing a course on what Israel reveals about the character of the United States. And that starts on February 24th. It actually will be available both in person and via Zoom. Dr. Duran will be giving the course from our offices in New York. So any Tikva Society members are welcome to come in person, and it would actually be wonderful to have you all here in person. So you can register for that now. It's up on our website, tikvafund.org/open. tikvafund.org/open is the website to register. Okay, with that, thanks so much, everybody, and over to you, Rabbi Sachs.
Thank you, Eitan, and nice to see all of you back again. And once again, I appreciate the many mails and comments and questions that I received during the week. And there's my email on the screen, and I'd be happy to hear from you again this week. And indeed, as we go forward and in the days and weeks and months to come. Tonight, we're talking about Agnon's very important novel, Achnasat Kala, known in English as The Bridal Canopy. Of course, Bridal Canopy was the translator's loosely chosen title. The bridal canopy, of course, the chuppah under which bride and groom come into marriage. But Hachnasat Kala is, of course, a rabbinic idiom, which means the money which is raised to provide a dowry, to set up a young couple in their marital home. And indeed, our story is the tale of Reb Yudel Chassid, who has 3 righteous daughters, but not very much money, and his attempt to raise the funds in order to marry off and support his children. This was Agnon's first novel. It has an interesting publication history, which we don't really have time to go into now, but very briefly, it appeared in serial format as a very short novel or long short story, I guess depends on your point of view, already beginning in 1919. And then it came out in a greatly expanded format as the centerpiece of the first edition of Agnon's collected Hebrew works, which were published in 1931. In 1937, the novel was translated into English. Agnon's patron, Shlomo Zalman Shulkin, understood that in order to have a world-class author, an author that maybe a committee in Stockholm might take interest in, he has to be available in European languages, in German, and of course, obviously, in English. And quite curiously, published by Doubleday in 1937 as The Bridal Canopy, the novel was selected by the Literary Guild of America, which was kind of like a Book of the Month club that marketed great literature to the working man or to the Iowa farm wife that wanted to have a collection of fine literature in her home. And because of this, the translator, a very interesting fellow named Israel Mayer Lask, who worked here for the Palestine Post, the precursor of today's Jerusalem Post, and was a somewhat significant translator of Hebrew and Yiddish literature into English in his day. He had to write a preface, which has been excised from later editions, which explains to the reader, what is this world that we're talking about? The world of Eastern European or Galician Jewry, the world of Hasidim v'anshe ma'aseh, the righteous men of Orthodox Judaism, which probably was quite unfamiliar to that Iowa farm wife who received the bridal canopy as a selection of the Literary Guild of America Book of the Month Club. What's significant, of course, to note was that in 1937, the world that Agnon depicts in the bridal canopy, a story which, mind you, is set over a century earlier. It's set around 1820 or so in Galicia, in Agnon's ancestral hometown, in what today is the Western Ukraine. But that world was very much extant. And although in the century that lapsed from the time the story is set to the time the story was published, and then a few more years to when it was translated, the world had undergone great transformations. Nevertheless, that world was still extant. This is a few years before it would be destroyed in the Holocaust. We read the story now as, a distant, ancient, old world which tragically, no longer exists. But at the time people were first reading the story, there were characters. One could have traveled to Eastern Europe, and the characters of the novel would have walked right off the page into the real world. Interestingly, in 1953, Agnon expanded the novel. The novel grew by over 20% of its length in the final edition, the edition which Hebrew readers have today, but it was never translated again in English. So the English translation is not complete. It's missing all of the material that Agnon added to the story after the first edition in book form. But that is not as significant as one imagines, because what we're dealing with here is a frame story. It's the story of this Rebudel Chassid who has to go out schnorring, collecting money. And as he goes from town to town and village to village in his quest, he has different adventures and he has different encounters. And like an accordion, the story can be stretched, like many great frame stories. Think of the Canterbury Tales, which we all probably, we're all people of a certain age who were the beneficiaries of a classic education. We all read the Canterbury Tales in high school, but we didn't read the entire Canterbury Tales, or at least very few of us did. Please let me know if you have read the Canterbury Tales cover to cover, because the Canterbury Tales is a frame story. It's the story of these pilgrims that gather in this inn, and they each tell their own story. So you don't have to read all of the stories, like the 1001 Arabian Nights. You needn't read all 1001 to get the sense. And if you know the frame and know some of the particularly well-known stories in the middle, you have a familiarity with the work. And of course, like the great quest story, Don Quixote. Cervantes' Don Quixote, which is often pointed to as the very first novel in the novel form in Western literature. What that means when we say that needs some unpacking, and we don't have time to do that now. But Don Quixote, first published in 1605, is pointed to as the first piece of literature in the form of a novel, is of course a frame story holding many individual tales, and you can condense it by taking out individual pieces. And that's what happens with Agnon's Hachnasat Kala, this elaborate frame story, but it's really quite an oxymoron. It's a sophisticated folk tale. It's both naive and subtle, and only through the master's pen are we able to dive into a work which works on both planes. I think you'll notice by now in our third session how often I keep coming back to this idea of Agnon's multivalence, like the story we saw last week, the fable of the goat, which can simultaneously be a very profound and deep and indeed troubling adult story, and also published in illustrated form for children. Agnon's Bridal Canopy is an ambivalent parody or satire on the world that it's depicting. It's ambiguous in that it simultaneously accepts and adores and valorates the world that it's depicting, and at the same time, he's rejecting many of its values. And the prejudiced reader to either side will identify with one side or the other. The story again is set around 1820 in and around the city of Brod or Brody in eastern Galicia, which is about 100 kilometers from the town of Rohatin, which becomes the other center of gravity in the story, the journey from one side to the other. We have a modern edition of the story. As a matter of fact, the only edition of an Agnon story with full annotation, published by Professor Avram Holtz of the Jewish Theological Seminary. The pages are laid out like pages of the Talmud, with the text in the middle and commentary along the side, and even a few very useful illustrations. He has a map as the end papers that show the wanderings of Reb Yudel in and around his environs in order to collect the dowry for his daughters. This parody that he portrays along Reb Yudel's quest is gentle, it's loving, it's not bitterly attacking the world that's depicted. Reb Yudel, this poor, impoverished Hasidic beggar, remains very much intact as a character. And indeed, he remains intact as a religious personality. Agnon, sitting in the second, third decades of the 20th century, looking back on a world a century earlier, turning back to the past, is surprising in the way that he does it, particularly in light of the way that so many of his predecessors and colleagues, the great Hebrew and Yiddish writers of his day and the generation or two before him, how they did it, how they skewered those figures of the past. And I'll come back to that momentarily. But Agnon is able to do this because of this sophisticated double vision that I've mentioned a few times. He's serious, but he's also playful. And in that way, he can see the world that he's depicting, the world of old Eastern European Jewry, both realistically, but also reverentially. He allows the old world a place in the new. And readers of The Bridal Canopy understand that he's neither a shill for tradition, nor is he attempting to undermine it. And the proclivity of an author to both adorate and alternatively satirize a given worldview doesn't in and of itself indicate his own position vis-a-vis that worldview. The ability to satirize something is really, well, the most Jewish reaction of all. And again, I think I must be committed at this point now that we must mention our teacher, Ruth Weiss, in each of our sessions. Her wonderful book, No Joke, her book on Jewish humor, has a lot to say on this topic. Anybody who knows anything at all about the institution of a Purim spiel, a Purim parodic play, which pokes fun at all of the sacred institutions about which no serious Jew would make light of, the other days of the year, the rabbi, the Rosh Hashiva, the Dayan, other institutions that are central and sacred, like marriage itself. On Purim, no holds are barred. Right? We take out all the stops, and it should not be surprising that in a work that does have such a reverential parody, Purim will play a significant role. Now, the story goes like this. It's clearly patterned on the classic Hasidic tales. Reb Yudel is a poor fellow. He has no money. He's dedicated to God. He's completely removed from worldly affairs, and immediately are confronted with a contrast between the spiritual and the material. This is the opening of the novel, The Bridal Canopy. It has this kind of a decorative introduction. Readers of Dickens will recognize such chapter headings. Readers of Mark Twain will recognize such chapter headings. This was kind of quite common in 19th century literature. Book 1, chapter 1, there once was a Hasid. Ish Hasid Haya in the Hebrew. And it goes like this. The following story deals with a devout man, a Hasid, who was so poor as to be overborne by his poverty. May mercy deliver us. But who always sat at the holy toil of the Torah, because he kept his distance from the current affairs of the world. So he had no commerce or traffickings nor dealings like other folk, but found his entire delight in God's Torah, both the generally revealed and that which was held secret, both the nigle and the nistar, the mystical or the Kabbalistic. He served the Lord in awe and fear and love, and never thought of acquiring honor through study or of being esteemed a scholar by himself or others, nor yet of his own advantage in assuring himself a portion in the world to come. He was a devout and sincere, and here Agnon is not satirizing, he's giving it to you sincerely. He really is portraying this character as a truly devout, sincere servant of God. He studied in order to fashion a seat for the divine presence. Kedei lasot kisei lashchina in the Hebrew, and to no other end whatsoever. This is a Kabbalistic notion, the idea of fashioning a seat for the divine presence in this world. It's a Kabbalistic metaphor, which means that when we study Torah, when we perform mitzvot in this world, we are, as it were, drawing a seat up to the table and inviting God to join us. It creates space in this physical world for the Shekhinah, the presence in our reality for the divine. And that's what he's doing through his service of God, through his Torah study, through his acts of kindness, through his performance of mitzvot, through his prayers. He is inviting God into our world. But this very idea, this Kabbalistic idea, is itself turning on the tension of the paradox of creating spiritual within the realm of the physical. And it sets this theme up throughout the whole novel. What does it mean to be a spiritual person? Someone committed to abstract divine ideals in a physical world. I don't just mean a physical world of atoms and molecules. I mean a physical world of herring and schnapps, a world where you need something to eat, where you need food to fill your belly and to feed your children, and where your devotion to God sometimes comes into conflict with those needs. It goes without saying, of course, that we're depicting a world where, although there were, of course, fabulously wealthy Jews, we're about to meet some, the overwhelming majority of Jewish society was plagued by terrible poverty. The next slide. His dwelling was underground in a damp, narrow, gloomy cellar, lacking seat upon which to sit and table at which to sit, bed upon which to lie, and all other household furniture, save a straw mat spread out on the ground. Upon it his folk would lie, never moving thence by night or day, so that their garments might not spoil even more. Of course, right here in the third sentence of the work, we're hit with Agnon's trademark irony. Reb Yudel, the sincere servant of God, is fashioning a seat for the divine presence, but this poor fellow doesn't even have a seat on which to sit himself. He doesn't have a seat, not a bench, not a bed. He sits in his damp basement hovel, he and his wife and his 3 daughters, and they lie, sit, spend their time on this mat on the floor, and they're careful not to move around too much so that their clothing shouldn't become abrasioned, because it's the only clothing that they have. So poverty-stricken was he that his only property was one cock called Reb Reveille, who used to rouse him to serve the Creator. And he had been named Reb Reveille because of the verse in Psalms. He rallied light through the darkness for the upright. Zarach b'choshech or le'asharim. The only property this fellow has is a rooster. And the purpose of the rooster is to cock-a-doodle-doo, so that he should wake up in the morning to run off to the service of God in the synagogue and study hall. In Hebrew, this rooster is called Rabbi Zarach. Zarach means to shine. Zricha is dawn, is sunrise, when the sun comes up and the rooster does what it is called to do. And he's called Rabbi Zarach because of this verse in Psalms, Zarach b'choshech, that God rallies, he shines the light through the darkness for the upright. The translator has taken a liberty by anglicizing the rooster's name to Reb Reveille, because the rooster's job is to rouse Reb Yudel for the service of God. The fact that the rooster himself is called Reb, is called Rabbi, that's just the mark of respect that every male figure in this world was afforded. There were rabbis, there were gedolim, there were rabbonim, there were Rosh Yeshiva, there were real serious Torah scholars. But every simple fellow, who knew the blessings to recite upon getting an aliyah in synagogue was a reb, right? Everybody's like a miniature rabbi of sort, even the rooster. Now this rooster is going to become significant. And I assume you all know without me having to spend time discussing it. If not, a quick trip to the Google machine will explain to you the idea of Chekhov's pistol, which if introduced in the first act has to fire in the third act. The only property poor Reb Yudel has is this rooster. And the whole time he's gone, throughout most of the novel, his one worry is that his wife, his long-suffering wife, will take his alarm clock, which is no mere alarm clock, but is the very device needed in order to enable him to pray and study and rouse himself from slumber. That, well, what might happen to poor Reb Reveille? He might end up as a chicken soup or a Shabbos dinner. There are other uses for a chicken in a home that's filled with people starving to death. But we'll come back to Reb Reveille before we are done, except to say that, of course, in Hebrew, a rooster can be called a gever or gavar. Right? There's a kind of homonym, without going into the etymology of the whole thing, in which a rooster shares the same name as a man. And as a rooster has a name which marks it as being distinctly masculine. Reb Yudel, like very many of Agnon's male characters, is quite passive. In very many of Agnon's stories, the women are the active characters, are the ones that take action into their own hands. And men are often depicted as being woefully passive. So what does it mean that this poor fellow who doesn't know how to rescue himself from his own poverty has as his only possession a man's man of a rooster? Well, we're gonna come back to this. If we can see the next slide. Ere his cock was done crowing, this poor chassid would speed to the house of study. His prayers ended, he never dashed away, as do the gluttons, to fill his frame with perishables and corruptible things, which increase the flesh and the worms that later feed thereon. But he would sustain his intellectual self on the story of the manna. There is a custom, not so widespread today, that at the end of the morning service, people would read verses from the book of Exodus that describe the manna, the divine food from heaven that the children of Israel were fed in the desert. And the recitation of that Parashat Haman, that section describing the heavenly manna that was fed to the Jews, was considered a kind of skula, a good luck omen or charm for parnosa, for livelihood. That just as God sustained our needs in the desert, so too he should sustain my needs and provide for everything that I require in the financial realm today. So what does a person do who, if he goes home, the cupboard is bare? He can't fill his belly with, warm toast and butter and coffee and eggs. So he sits and he recites the Parashat Haman, And if his desires rebel and turn too strongly towards matter of food and drink, he would subdue them with a page of Gemara. He would study Torah, because if you can't have the physical, you can substitute that with the spiritual. Now, this chassid was charged with the care of daughters, each older than the next by a year or more. I have made a few emendations in the translation. The translation, which again was done in 1935, is quite antiquated. We really are in need of a new translation of the work, and the full work at that. But even when it was published in 1935, the translator chose a kind of antiquated register to telegraph to the reader that we were talking about an old, world which is not exactly the world of today. That is, the three daughters, Gittele, the youngest, was about 17. Then came Bluma, her sister, who was about 19. And the oldest of all was Pesela, the firstborn, about 20. Now, to be a 20-year-old girl in this world at that time and not to be married was, you were already over the hill. They were ragged and barefoot without proper clothing or garments, so they stayed at home perforce and never showed their faces in the street. And they were charming, graceful, and fair, with well-grown breasts and well-grown hair. But within their hearts, alas, fluttered despair at the days of their youth that were almost done. But redeemers from their maidenhood, there were none. In the Hebrew, this is also couplets and rhymes, and the translator's done a passable job of capturing that in English. The next slide. And when the youngest reached the age at which a virgin should be wed, from it, the wife of the chassid in question began to address herself to her husband. How much longer, said she to him, will you be as unfeeling as a raven toward your children? Have you no pity for your hapless, hopeless daughters who sit sighing and weeping like wives whose husbands have vanished? Again, a reference to the aguna, which we've spoken of in previous sessions. And who know not whether they are widowed or not? Why, the girls have all but wept their eyes away, and the hair on their head is turning white. Yet here you sit like a lump of clay in form of a man, without lifting a finger to marry them off. So from it, always the practical one, who realizes that we're not going to solve this problem through prayer and the study of Torah, goes to find a solution. Where does one find a solution in this world at that time? She goes to the Rebbe. She goes to the Rebbe of Apt, the Apter Rav, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was the great-grandfather of Abraham J. Heschel, the noted 20th century philosopher, who was an actual real historical figure. There are a number of actual real historical figures that populate the work. This Rabbi Avram Yoshua Heschel, the Rebbe, the Hasidic master of Apt, was known as the Ohev Yisrael, the lover of Israel, both after the characteristic that he possessed, as well as the name of a Torah commentary that he wrote by that work. He died in 1825, just a number of years after our story is set. And he instructs Reb Yudel that it is time to go out and become a beggar in order to raise the dowry. But not only should he be looking for money to marry off his daughters, he should be looking for a son-in-law to make a shidduch for the eldest. And he makes only one condition, that when he finds a son-in-law, the mechutin, the father-in-law, the father of the groom, will offer a certain amount of money for the dowry. And you, Reb Yudel, should match it. Whatever the father-in-law offers, you should match it down to the last penny. With the disguise of proper clothing, because you can't send Reb Yudel out in his threadbare clothing. In other words, in order, even a schnorrer, even a beggar needs to look respectable. So they dress him in a proper kaftan, and they take a pillow and they pad his stomach so that he looks like he's got a little flesh on his bones, because as he is, he looks like a scarecrow. Nobody would take him seriously. He wouldn't appear to be a mensch. He would appear to be a real person. So they send him out in this kind of disguise with a wagon and a wagoneer, a wagon driver named not Sancho Panza, but Nuta. Nuta, the driver, like Sancho Panza to Don Quixote, sees the world in a much more, let's say, realistic or practical way. And the two of them together head off in their journey with their two horses. These two horses whose thoughts we are privy to. Right? We hear the thoughts and conversations. We, the reader, hear the thoughts and conversations of the two horses as they go about the highways and byways and towns and villages of the Eastern Europe of Galicia. Yudel is a man of simple faith. When Yudel turns to the page of Gemara, unlike his wife Frumet, who realizes this is not going to go, Yudel realizes that since all things accord with God's will and his word, my job, in order to make things happen the way that they should, is to sit and study. But Reb Yudel doesn't sit and study in order to kind of throw his hands up in the air. Reb Yudel sits and studies and prays as a form of religious activism. It's a stance that it's difficult for us moderns to identify with. Us moderns, be we people of faith or be we people of skepticism. We often look at these attitudes in the ultra-Orthodox world, where they're more common, with a certain amount of cynicism. But it's important to note here that Agnon portrays Reb Yudel as being quite sincere. Since the world accords itself with God's will, it's only a question of whether or not I, Reb Yudel, will be worthy of his salvation. And therefore, my sitting and dedicating myself to Torah study, instead of going out and working, is quite sincerely depicted as within Reb Yudel's point of view. Forget what we, or even forget what Agnon may have thought or felt in judgment of Reb Yudel, but Reb Yudel, within Reb Yudel's point of view, is doing the most activist thing that he can. He is trying to align himself with God's will so that he will be worthy of God's intervention and salvation. In other words, in order to allow God to do his work, I had better sit and study in order to merit the benefits of that. His turn to the page of Talmud is actually, within his worldview, an act of religious activism. It's not a kind of passive abandonment of his fatherly responsibilities, but Frumet knows better. And once sent off into the world, Yudel has to accommodate travel and lodging and encounters with all types of people that he didn't see in his normal course of things. To shorten the story greatly, over the course of a number of months, Reb Yudel succeeds in collecting about 200 gold coins. How much is 200 gold coins? I don't know, but we'll discover it's not a lot. It's not enough to marry off 3 daughters, but it's more money than Reb Yudel has ever seen in his life. When they get to this town of Rohatim, again, about 100 kilometers from where he had started, he and Nuta put up at an inn, and Reb Yudel, knowing that he's got 200 gold coins, more money than he's ever thought of, than he's ever imagined existed, he thinks it's immoral for him to continue on with his quest, because the whole time, for the many months they were on the road, well, you know, when you're traveling, it's sometimes hard to get to shul to pray with a minyan, and there's not so much time to sit and study the Talmud. And now that he's sitting in this inn and he's got, you know, money in his purse, he should sit and study and learn. So he sits in this inn studying the Talmud. The townsmen are puzzled. They assume that this fellow must be a very wealthy man. Because after all, who has the luxury to sit in a hotel room studying Torah, if not a wealthy man? And in another instance of confused identity and disguise and mistaken identity, all themes, by the way, which align with Purim. I mentioned Purim a while ago. You know, Purim, this holiday of masks. Purim, the holiday of Esther, whose true identity is unknown to even to her own husband, to King Achashverosh. There's a confusion about who this fellow is. Rabbi Yudel is known as Rabbi Yudel Chassid. Rabbi Yudel the Chassid, Rabbi Yudel the righteous. Yudel, of course, is just a Yiddish diminutive of Yehuda, of Judah. But his name, as called up to the Torah, is Yudel, Yehuda ben Natan. His father's name was Nathan. It happens there was, in Galicia at this time, an actual historical figure, a fabulously wealthy Jew named Yehuda Noton Zon, or anglicized Nathanson. Nathanson, the son of Nathan, ben Natan. And our Reb Yudel ben Natan is confused for the fabulously wealthy Yehuda Noton Zon. I mean, think about it. How many Bill Gateses are there in America? Probably quite a few. It's not that uncommon a name. Right? Look in your local phone book. There's probably more than one William Gates who lives in your town even, but it's probably not the Bill Gates you've heard of, right? Imagine a charity agency, is going door to door, and they find that they're the home of Bill Gates. They think they've struck it rich, but it's really just Bill Gates the butcher or Bill Gates the shoemaker, right? So they assume that he's wealthy because he has the luxury to sit and learn. Remember what Tevye said, right? If I were rich, I'd have the time that I lack to sit in the synagogue and pray, right? And I'd learn the holy books with the learned men 7 hours every day. That is the poor man's image of the luxuries afforded to a wealthy man. And he has the name of this wealthy man. And it's reported he's in the market for a shidduch for his daughter. Well, the line is going around the corner. Who wouldn't want to marry their son off to the daughter of Yehuda Natan Zon? Along comes Reb Vavi Shor, the richest man in town. But to be the richest man in Roatin is a lot less than to be the richest man in a bigger city. He has a son, Sheftel, who seems like a very nice young boy. And he, Reb Vavi Shor, promises 12,000 gold coins to the dowry. Our Reb Yudel is delighted, and he pledges 12,000 gold coins to the dowry. They shake hands, they sign the agreement, and it's decided that in a short while, this Shor family will come to Brody, to Reb Yudel's hometown, where bride and groom will meet, probably only once, very briefly, and then the wedding will be arranged. It's important to note that even though everyone else is misled, Reb Yudel himself has no idea that they don't understand the reality. He is unaware that they think he is the richest magnate in the Jewish world. Reb Yudel never sets out to deceive anyone, but yet everyone around him is in fact led astray. But the question is, how could he possibly have pledged 12,000 gold coins for the dowry when in a few months of work he had succeeded in only raising 200 gold coins? Isn't that deception? In what reality could Reb Yudel possibly have produced 12,000 gold coins? How could he make good on this golden pledge? So it's very simple. You remember the Rebbe, the Hasidic master of Apt, had told him, this is my condition. Despite the fact that he only has 200 coins in his purse, he knows, since the Rebbe told him to do this, surely God will provide. And this is the end of book 1. in book 2, the second half of the novel, Rabbi Yudel heads back home where the wedding will be performed. A short while later, the groom's family arrive, and there's this scene. I mean, it's almost straight out of a Marx Brothers movie. On Purim, the groom's family sends mishloach manot, Purim gifts, to the home of Rabbi Yudel Natanson, which get delivered to the home of the wealthy Rabbi Yudel Natanson. In the home of Rabbi Yudel, the wealthy Rabbi Yudel Natanson, is our Rabbi Yudel, who, like all the poor people of the town, have lined up to collect their matanot le'evyonim, the gifts to the poor that are dispensed on that day. In the home of Rabbi Yudel Natanson, where our Rabbi Yudel, threadbare once again, is present, there's a little Purim spiel going on, a Purim play. And what is being performed in the Purim play? You know, like the play within the play that we know from Shakespeare. There's a character who is Rabbi Yudel that is not Rabbi Yudel, because the wonder tales of Rabbi Yudel's adventures have already become exaggerated into the things of legend in the town by none other than Nota, who, having arrived back in Brody and probably had one too many things to drink in the local inn, has been spinning the tales of Rabbi Yudel. So in the home of Rabbi Yudel Natanson, we have Rabbi Yudel Natanson. We have our Rabbi Yudel, who is confused for Rabbi Yudel Natanson. We have a Purim actor playing out the tales of Rabbi Yudel Natanson, and we have a gift that arrives from the in-laws to Rabbi Yudel Natanson. It gets delivered to the rich man, who was very surprised to discover that he now has these in-laws, because in fact, he is childless. He has no daughter to marry off. When the family actually does arrive, when the family actually does arrive and finds our Rabbi Yudel once again in his threadbare clothing, they're outraged. They've been fooled. They've been tricked. It's a scandal. But Rabbi Yudel calms them down, and he says, "Why don't you come for dinner tonight, and we'll talk it over?" You know, it's like a bad episode of the Dick Van Dyke Show, or of I Love Lucy. You know, the husband comes home, says, "Lucy, the boss is coming home for dinner." Right? I Dream of Jeannie, Bewitched. Right? In other words, he's bringing home the boss for dinner. She has to throw something together at the last minute. What is Frumit going to make for the Machatanim? She doesn't have 2 turnips to rub together. So she runs. What does a Jew do when he or she finds himself in trouble? She runs to the rabbi. And the rabbi says, "Rabbi Zarach, it's now Rabbi Zarach's moment. It is time to fire Chekhov's pistol. It's Rabbi Zarach's time to stick his neck out and take one for the team, and you'll make Rabbi Zarach for the dinner." Rabbi Zarach is dispatched with the daughter to the shochet, to the slaughterer. And Rabbi Zarach, with a knife at his throat, with the shochet's knife of Damocles hanging at his head or at his throat, he does the only reasonable thing. He runs away. The rooster is the only one that takes matters into his own hands. The rooster is more of a man's man than the man. The man turns to the page of Talmud, turns to the prayer book. The rooster knows that when you're in an existential threat, you have to take action. He gets out of the hands of the daughter. He runs away. She runs after him. He runs into the forest. She follows. He goes into a cave. She's right on his heels. And what's discovered in the cave? A vast treasure. Gold and diamonds and rubies and pearls, all squirreled away in this cave. the novel has been criticized for its deus ex machina approach. I call it the rooster ex machina. You know this idea of in Greek drama, at the end of the play, to resolve all the plot lines, sometimes the Greek god Zeus or whomever would be lowered with a pulley onto the stage from on high, from Olympus, right? And that machina, that machine, that pulley that would lower the actor onto the stage, gave rise to this idea of the deus ex machina, a kind of plot twist, often supernatural at the end, which ties up all of the loose ends in the action of the play. So Agnon was criticized for this deus ex machina ending, this rooster ex machina ending. But of course, it also plays into the idea that ours is really a Purim story. Venahafachu. It all turns around at the last minute. The disaster is averted. Salvation comes from where it comes. The abrupt solution, no matter how contrived and unexpected intervention of this new event, saves the day. And with these riches, Yudel is able to marry off all three daughters, and he becomes finally a wealthy man. And he and Frumit actually head off at the end of the novel for the land of Israel. This, of course, is completely anachronistic because, by and large, Jews from Galicia were not going off on Aliyah to the land of Israel, and it was considered something of like an ex post facto or a retrograding of the Zionism of Agnon's time at the time of the writing of the novel back into the story as a kind of way of saying that no Jewish story can be fully resolved, salvation cannot be fully complete unless the Jew finds himself back in the land of Israel. Of course, the story ends with a marriage, just like in Shakespeare, by the way. You know you've been watching a comedy in Shakespeare if the play ends with a marriage. If it's a tragedy, it ends with a death. But in Shakespeare's comedies, we end with a marriage. So here we end with a marriage, but we don't only end with a marriage, we end with a marriage and with the Jew returning to the land of Israel. The question, of course, though, is what does Reb Yudel believe has happened? He has a firm belief throughout the whole novel that he'll be saved by a miracle if he only sticks to his divine mission. And when the deliverance indeed actually arrives, we, the reader, are left to determine what the nature of this salvation is. After all, what kind of miracle is brought about through poultry? Can we have a rooster Messiah? Right? Is Reb Yudel naively pious, or is he merely ridiculous, or both? Those are questions, after we accept who Reb Yudel is within his own eyes, these are questions we, the reader, have to ask for ourselves. Throughout the novel, we've now been discussing the frame of the novel. In the selections that we gave you, I included one very short standalone story, the story of the mouse and the rooster, a separate rooster, not our Reb Reveille. It's a kind of parable. I mean, it reads almost like like a Judaized Aesop fable. But if you read it, you'll see it's a rather typical anecdote or typical standalone story, which is embedded within the larger frame story. But what does it do? What message does it send? All of the individualized tales within the frame story are all in dialogue with the themes of the book. And what is it telling us? It's reminding us that there's justice in the world, that the righteous are rewarded, the wicked are punished, that in the end, everyone gets what is coming to them if they deserve it. The question of the rooster, the question of Reb Reveli as the agent of salvation makes us think, well, the rooster is the agent of salvation. When there is this existential threat, Reb Reveli runs and Reb Yudel learns. He sits with a page of the Talmud. The miraculous reversal of fortune at the end is essential to the novel insofar as the novel is kind of imitating or walking in the template of a traditional folktale, because it vindicates the idea of hashgacha. It vindicates the idea of divine providence, that God is running the world. Here, the parody, Agnon's parody, is in our having to see both sides of it. Because all throughout the novel, Agnon has reminded us, the narrator, I should say, has reminded us, as Rabbi Yudel and Nutta are traversing all the different places throughout the world, that in the days of old, when there'd be pogroms, going back to 1648 and 1649, the Gzerot Tach V'Tat, the Chmielnitsky uprising and pogroms, Jews very frequently would bury their treasures in the hope that if they survived the sword, they would be able to return home and dig up their treasure in order to regain their lives. But of course, we know very many Jews did not return to reclaim their treasures. So many times throughout the novel, Rabbi Yudel and Nutta themselves are aware that, at any point here underneath the ground, there might be Aladdin's riches, but we just don't know about it. So when the rooster and the daughter discover the treasure in the cave, well, it's interpreted as a miracle. It's salvation. Reb Yudel indeed becomes the wealthy man. The promises that he made were not false promises, even if at the time that they were made, no one could have imagined fortune would have turned out in his favor. But because God rewards his righteous servants, exactly as Rabbi Yudel hoped would happen, it indeed did happen. But we, the reader, know that there's a very pedestrian explanation, a very natural, not supernatural explanation for how one could find a cachet of buried treasure. All of the framed anecdotes and folk tales within the story connect to the plot, because each contains these themes and motifs of the larger tale. Each serves as a play within the play. It's getting rather late, but I did want to do two other things, if you'll indulge me with just a few extra minutes than we usually take. I had mentioned two great literary characters, and we had sent out, I think, an interesting article, of course, drawing our attention to Shalom Aleichem. If we can see the next slide. Agnon had said, and then it was recorded, Agnon had said to his friend Aleph Mem Haberman, in reference to this character, many years later, consider what I did with the pauper Reb Yudel Chassid in my novel, The Bridal Canopy. I created him as a person of substance, with charm after his own fashion, despite the events that befell him. What would our other writers have done with a character like this? Mendele Mocher Svarim, the great Yiddish author, would have made him ridiculous in order to twist and poke. Shalom Aleichem, the author of the Tevye stories, would have made him the object of simple mockery. I sweetened the bitterness of Reb Yudel's poverty, removing the ridicule, making the pauper a more perfect character, although clearly it would be better if there were no paupers at all. The next slide. Who is Tevye? How is that world of poverty, and indeed the world of shidduchim? In the writers that preceded Agnon, the great Hebrew and Yiddish authors, very often the world of shidduchim, of arranged marriages, were the height of the perfect object for a ridicule of the old world. It's important to note that those of us that know the Tevye stories, Tevye the Milchiker, Tevye the dairyman, those who know the stories only from Fiddler on the Roof, the play or the movie, do not know Tevye, at least not the way he's meant to be known. And we really do recommend, of course, we have this wonderful course that Ruth Weiss, again, has offered at Tikva, and which can be accessed through the archives of Tikva, and I can't recommend it highly enough. But we also have, in wonderful translation, for those that can't read the Yiddish, we have a wonderful translation by Hillel Halkin, the Tevye stories. And really, everyone owes it to themselves to read them. But even with all the differences between the play and the source material, the movie and the source material, there is something about Tevye, and Tevye, like Reb Yudel, is a character who is constantly in dialogue with God. Tevye is in many ways a very tragic character. Yudel lacks the tragedy that visited upon Tevye, more so in the source material than in the play and the novel. Although in the play and the novel, Tevye also suffers his blows. But Tevye, like Yudel, is a man in constant communion with the divine. Yudel has blind trust in God. Yudel is also a Talmid Chacham. He is an authentic Torah scholar. He's not recognized as a very important, significant rabbi, but Tevye is, Yudel is, despite being an impoverished Jew and something of a simple Jew and a man of simple faith, but he is learned in the law. Tevye is a Yehudi Pashut, right? Not just a simple Jew, but something of a simpleton. And all of his wisdom is of the folksy variety. If Yudel has blind trust in God, Tevye has a very critical trust in God. If Yudel is always praying to God, Tevye is arguing with him. And just, for the pure enjoyment of it, we're going to watch a very short clip from the film that demonstrates this.
Dear God, was that necessary? Did you have to make him lame just before the Sabbath? That wasn't nice. It's enough you pick on me. Bless me with 5 daughters, a life of poverty. That's all right. But what have you got against my horse? Really, sometimes I think, when things are too quiet up there, you say to yourself, let's see, what kind of mischief can I play on my friend Tevye?
Aha! So you're finally here, my breadwinner.
I'll talk to you later.
So why are you late today?
His foot went lame.
Well, hurry up. The sun won't wait, and I have something important to say to you.
Still have some deliveries in the village.
You'll be late for the Sabbath.
I won't be late.
You'll be late.
I won't be late. I won't be late. If you ever stop talking, I won't be late.
You can die from such a man.
As the good book says, heal us, O Lord, and we shall be healed. In other words, send us the cure. We've got the sickness already. Well, I'm not really complaining. After all, with your help. Yeah. I'm starving to death. Oh, dear Lord. You made many, many poor people. I realize, of course, it's no shame to be poor. But it's no great honor either. So what would have been so terrible if I had a small fortune? If I were a rich man, yabba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dum. All day long I biddy-biddy-bum. If I were a wealthy man.
On some other occasion, maybe we can gather to sing the song. I know people always like to do that. In the clip, which here really is reflective of the Tevye stories, we see Tevye as an arguer with his destiny. In this regard, we compare him to Reb Yudel, who is resigned to his destiny because he knows or he believes that God works things out the way they ought to be. And in his story, even though we may think it was all just plain simple rooster luck, in fact, that's what happens. The other great literary character of which we have to make mention, to which I alluded before, is of course Don Quixote. There he is. I love the fact that in Spain they've repurposed Picasso's famous iconic illustration of Don Quixote as a traffic signal. We wouldn't want tourists to go tilting at those windmills in southern Spain. Don Quixote again sets the template for the bridal canopy. Don Quixote, of course, plays an outsized role in the Hebrew imagination. It's been translated dozens of times into Yiddish, into Hebrew. In 1912, Chaim Nachman Bialik already did an adapted translation into Hebrew, but he was not the first. Since the 1880s, Don Quixote has been translated numerous times, and it plays a significant role. In colloquial Hebrew, we talk about the Don Quixote, right? This kind of character, because we Israelis, after all, we are people that go off tilting at windmills, imagining them to be giants. We dream the impossible dream, to paraphrase the musical version of the Man of La Mancha. But there is significant overlap between the two stories, and not just in the template of the two stories. It's true that all great quest literature draws comparison. We can compare Don Quixote and Sancho to Reb Yudel and Nata, and to Frodo and Sam, and to all characters in epic literature that go off on some journey. But these are Don Quixote and Reb Yudel, these are satires of the quest, because neither hero learns anything along the way. They don't change their perspective. This is the reason that Reb Yudel, because he doesn't change his perspective, this is why Reb Yudel ends up being semi-comical. We laugh at what happens, while we're delighted that this fellow should land on his feet and land in the land of Israel and support his family and be the recipient of a great hidden treasure. Don Quixote, who continues to see the world the way he sees it, not understanding that he is not indeed a knight errant, not knowing his true station in the world, or that of his beloved lady, he is semi-tragic. Yudel is lacking in the tragedy, as I mentioned by way of comparison to Tevye. Both Don Quixote and Reb Yudel are influenced by the books that they read. If you're unfamiliar with the basic plot of Don Quixote, make a trip to the Wikipedia and fill yourself in. But having read these tales of knights errant and their chivalry, and they're going out and rescuing damsels in distress, Don Quixote, this somewhat older man, takes rusty armor and a kind of broken down old nag and heads off to fight giants and to win the right to the love of his fair maiden. And it's a portrait of how one's reading can cause you to go mad, or at least to see the world as it is not in fact. Rabbi Yudel has also been influenced by his reading, but Rabbi Yudel's reading is the Talmud, is the Hasidic literature. Right? It's the books that encapsulate a worldview of how divine providence works and how reward is gained. And it emphasizes those books that Rabbi Yudel reads and is influenced by, emphasize the spirit over the physical, the otherworldly over the this worldly. And this is the cause of the great comedy of errors, of the great Purim spiel, which is the bridal canopy. For Reb Yudel, as for Don Quixote, the world as it is may be contradicted and overridden by the word, by the revealed word. For Reb Yudel, the word of God. For Don Quixote, the word of the books that he reads in his texts. And the attempt to reconcile the two either leads the novel towards tragedy of Cervantes or salvation and humorous salvation of the parodic Agnon's Don Quixote, Agnon's bridal canopy. But yet, Agnon couldn't leave well enough alone. If one knows Agnon only from reading the bridal canopy, you would think they lived happily ever after, which is quite atypical for Agnon's writings. 90 years later, after Reb Yudel has gone off to the land of Israel and died a happy death, 90 years later, one of his descendants, his great-great-grandson, Yitzchak Kumer, the protagonist of Agnon's great novel, Tmol Shalshom, in English called Only Yesterday, a member of the second Aliyah, the same cohort of people that leave Europe to come up to the land of Israel in the decade before World War I, goes off to Jaffa and to Jerusalem. And it's very difficult, and he struggles. And unlike Reb Yudel, unlike the comedy of the bridal canopy, Yitzchak Kumer and Only Yesterday is a tragedy. And all the while, Yitzchak Kumer is thinking, I remember my great-great Zaidi, my great-great-grandfather, he was saved by a miracle. And I surely could use a miracle, but I know I won't receive one. Because in order to receive a miracle like Reb Yudel, one must believe in miracles like Reb Yudel. And we no longer have the faith of the Reb Yudels, and we must suffer in a world where we crash up against the rocks of reality and can't escape it into the fantasy through the faith of those that came before. I apologize for going on a little bit longer than usual. We were interrupted in the middle by a momentary blackout. But here we are. Those are our thoughts on the bridal canopy. Before we open it to questions, oh, there you are, Eitan.
Hello.
Before we open it to questions, should we talk about next week?
Yes, please. Let's dive into next week. And for those of you who are on the Zoom, also please stay with us for a Q&A.
Next week, we're looking at Agnon's other great novel, Oreach Natal Alun, in English as A Guest for the Night. Once again, we'll send out a sample sample material from the novel. It's, for our purposes, it's not necessary to read the whole novel, although we recommend doing that as a project at some point. It's a novel of a kind of nostalgic homecoming in which a narrator, where the autobiographical level is very close to the surface, a narrator who we would be forgiven for thinking the narrator is Agnon himself, goes back to Buchach, to his hometown, after having lived abroad in Israel for a number of years. And he arrives there in 1930 and spends a number of months in the town and is shocked at what he discovers after having been away for many, many, many years, and is shocked to discover that he is a guest at home. That's the guest of the title, right? And the idea of being a guest at home, of course, is quite disorienting. And it has to do with a kind of elegy for the world of Buchach, of Agnon's hometown left behind, and the fact that the novel is published literally on the eve of the Holocaust, and our knowledge of what happens to the civilization that was left behind only weighs heavily over the novel. We also sent a very short book chapter which examines some of the major themes in the novel and serves as a kind of plot summary for the whole thing for people that are looking to fill in their knowledge.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Rabbi Sachs, and thanks everyone for joining us on the YouTube. Please come back next week. We'll see you next week. And once again, those of you who are our society members, please stay on for the Q&A.